Thanks for joining us on a special edition of Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman will join us shortly. Tonight, the latest in our series, WTTW News, A Safer City. Every Monday in July and August, we're devoting our entire program to the issues of public and community safety. We're also prioritizing public safety in our online coverage as well, including at WTTW.com/safercity. Tonight, a deep dive into how media covers crime and violence with conversations focused on how those depictions have affected communities and efforts to change the narrative. And here's what we're looking at. 3 local journalists share their insights on how local news covers crime and how those portrayals impact communities.
I actually don't watch the news.
We meet future storytellers who want to change the narrative about violence in their communities. And what's misunderstood about social media and violence. All that right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors. Chicago Tonight's coverage of public safety is supported by the Su Ling Jin Charitable Foundation Initiative for Reducing Violence in Chicago.
And thanks again for being with us. Summer Mondays in Chicago often mean news outlets are all covering some version of the same story, the weekend's violence. In this week's edition of our summer series, WTTW News, A Safer City, we're turning the lens on ourselves and the media's coverage of the city's persistent problem. We start off by hearing from some future media makers about their impressions of how violence is covered in their communities and how they plan to change it. Brandis Friedman joins us now from North Lawndale with more. Brandis.
In Paris, we're here at the new home of Free Spirit Media. That's an organization that's been around for about 20 years, more than 20 years really, working with young people on media arts and creative storytelling. This community, though, North Lawndale, it is also home for some of those Free Spirit Media participants, and they tell us they believe that the mainstream media is missing out largely on what this neighborhood really means to them. 19-year-old Jalea Davis says she's not one for watching local TV news.
They don't show the love that we show and how we support each other in neighborhoods, how we help out, like how you walk down the street, people could just, hey, how you doing? Talk to you. They don't show that part.
Because of its coverage of violence.
Because it's kind of traumatizing to look to before you go to sleep, because once again, it's always shining on like the negative instead of like the positive of what's going on. When you hear about Chicago, they always say about like the bad things. It's so much violence.
And she's not alone. 24-year-old Nate Suggs points to a lack of context in mainstream media coverage.
How you portray a subject in its fullness truly affects how someone can digest it, right? So I think that, again, we don't really contextualize the people who we define as perpetrators as victims. We don't understand how a lack of resources affects their decision making, how they have themselves been, victimized by the system that, they're trying to thrive in.
They're both participants in Free Spirit Media, a nonprofit that works with young people 11 to 25 years old from the west and south sides of Chicago.
But we're gonna have to really put that in that's gonna take a lot to edit.
Staff here work to teach students to create media arts projects like short films and news stories to amplify their own voices.
They're their own heroes. They can also be their own villains, but it's up to them to tell their own story. They have the means, especially in the age that we're existing in.
So the first thing that I'll show you is kind of how I put these on for work.
Today, they're receiving training from a Free Spirit alumnus, photographer Vashawn Jordan.
Learning about the different types of cameras and the camera benefits, what's to look for in a camera. How he started from this specific program, it gave me hope that I could be anything.
And learning to tell their own stories is how they plan to change the narrative.
And I just want them to know it's okay to be unique, be yourself. You don't have to be no one else. We all go through stuff. No one's perfect. Just really shine a light on it and get them advice.
Creative Pathways Director Candace Abioye also points to the need for stories about the community to come from the community to snap a complete picture.
We have young people that are here that are, walkable. They're down the street. It's but this is home for me. And I'm not saying that some of this stuff doesn't happen, but it's nah, but that's my grandma's house, or that's my school location. So it's how does the news coverage again, get on the ground, or let the young people who are already on the ground be able to tell those stories because they understand with the fresh eyes.
The group hopes more Chicagoans and those outside the city can experience their community through the lens of young storytellers like Nate and Jalea.
I see like they always have like block club parties or giveaways. Like the school, they're actually still open, and they just had like a barbecue with like alumni that like graduated. So they're about giving back, but they don't show that.
So you see the positive in your community.
I actually experienced it. That's the good part.
Yeah. Now, of course, the room, it's empty now as programming here is done for the day. But as I mentioned, this is a new location for Free Spirit Media. The purpose being to be literally on the ground floor, more community-centric, right here on the corner of Ogden and Central Park in what's called the Ogden Corridor. The group is renting from the West Side Association for Community Action, which has a history of organizing. The executive director for Free Spirit Media tells me, though, that lends itself very well to one of the missions for Free Spirit, which is to build meaningful relationships with the community around it. Paris, back to you.
All right, Brand, it's great profile of important work that they're doing. Thanks very much. So following up on the concerns raised by those young people, is violent crime really out of control, or are media outlets disproportionately impacting our perception of it? Joining us now to explore how the media covers crime and violence are Morgan Elise Johnson, co-founder and publisher of The Tribe. That's a digital media platform reporting on the experiences of Black Chicagoans. Charles Whitaker, dean and professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, and recently retired CBS 2 anchor and reporter Derek Blakely, who now writes for the Center for Illinois Politics website. Thank you all for being here. It's great to see all of you. So starting with you, Charles Whitaker, when we talk about local TV news, local newspapers, national news, are they giving an accurate portrayal of violent crime in Chicago, or are they distorting the picture of what's going on by the way they report on it?
I don't know that they are distorting it, but as was said in the earlier piece, they're not providing any context, right? We are still prisoners to our conventions of storytelling, which is if it bleeds, it leads. We know that that gets eyeballs, and we still are also trapped by the constraints of our formats, the 30-minute newscast, which doesn't allow us to provide the time and the context, the ability to explore how and why we have the crime that we have. I don't know that we're necessarily hyping the violence. The violence is there, but we're not providing a full picture.
Derek Blakely, you spent many, many years in local newsroom and national newsroom talking about that if it bleeds, it leads strategy, focusing on violent crimes and homicide. What about your thoughts on how that is impacting the public's perception of safety in Chicago neighborhoods?
Well, I think if you take a historical perspective, it shines some light on this. You know, there was certainly an increase in crime during the George Floyd uprising and during the pandemic. That was real. But the crime is out of control narrative is skewed. Most people don't realize that, you know, Chicago had its record number of murders during Mayor Daley 1 in 1974 and Mayor Daley 2 in 1992, and no one was saying crime is out of control then. We have a sharper lens. And by the way, during those 2 years, something like 200 more people were murdered in Chicago.
It was approaching 1,000.
Yes, than were murdered last year.
Right.
So it's important to realize that. I think this started before the pandemic, and actually was led by, I think, the newspapers. I remember the Tribune started, in particular, started recording a weekend murder tally and weekly murder tallies, and in a way they hadn't before, and that that increased people's perception that crime was definitely a bigger problem, perhaps, than it was.
It doesn't seem like an editorial shift to start focusing on weekend crime, as you say, or individual crime like that. Morgan Elise Johnson, speaking of what Derek said, there's a Trib op-ed that cites that violent crime before the pandemic was about 1/3 of what it was in the 90s. So again, this perception, this skewed perception, how does that impact the communities that are at the center of this?
Well, I would say that the news media does a lot to shape the attitudes and public perception of crime and safety. And even as the media has a role in defining what crime is, right? The crime beat mostly follows shootings, homicides, and property theft, but there are so many ways that people break the law, right? But those types of crimes affect a certain demographic of people, and then it also helps to shape what we think as like public safety issues and what our societal priorities should be. So I think that the media has a huge responsibility in like choosing the stories that we see that they're not really taking responsibility for.
Well, Charles Whitaker, in that 30-minute time frame, how can a local TV newscast do a better job than providing context and not just spot reporting on individual crimes?
I think you have to have the courage of your conviction to do just that, to actually have moments in time where we will sort of take a historical perspective. As Derek said, there was a time when the murder rate was far higher than it is now. We need that perspective today. We need, as Morgan said, to get a sense of crime holistically and not just those most sensational crimes that kind of lead us all to believe that we're living in this dystopian hellscape.
Derek, all your years in local TV, were you ever frustrated with your news directors or management in terms of what their approach was to covering crime and just the constant spot news reporting?
Well, I can't tell you how many times I had to knock on the door of a family of a murder victim. That is not pleasant, to try to talk to them. What I tried to do was to convince them that I was going to tell the story of the person in their family who had been lost, with integrity and with sensitivity, and to make them into a human being, not a statistic. But I think what newsrooms need to do probably is focus on fewer crimes and more intentionally decide what they cover. And ask themselves the question, what light is this going to shine on the greater problem? This particular crime, reporting on this particular crime. There have been, some improvements. We don't do perp walks anymore, and there's less use of mugshots in low-level crimes.
Especially if it's younger offenders.
Exactly. But another improvement that can be made is, in some places, newsrooms are committing to cover a crime from beginning to end. If they make a decision in the beginning to cover it, then they cover it through the trial and the process. Now that's a big commitment because that can be a long process, especially in Cook County where murder trials drag on for years, as the Tribune has highlighted recently. But if you don't do that, if there's an acquittal, if a conviction is overturned, then the person who has been identified as a suspect never ultimately gets that story told either, if you don't follow the case to the conclusion.
And that could impact the rest of their lives. Morgan Elise Johnson, one of the things that you've said before is that you believe local media kind of runs with the police narrative of things when it comes to crimes. Can you just expound on that? Because this was a big issue that came up in the Laquan McDonald case.
Yes, absolutely. Breaking news reporting relies heavily on the police to set narrative. We get the press release from the police, or we attend a press conference, and then we regurgitate that information to the public. But, the CPD has a consent decree because they violated the civil rights of Black residents. So how can we say that crime news storytelling is impartial if we're relying so heavily on an anti-Black institution?
In the Laquan McDonald case, a lot of media organizations had to take a look in the mirror because the police would offer sort of a spokesperson right on the scene there, and a lot of times media would kind of run with the facts that they provided. So that's something that I think that the news media has been working on. Charles Whitaker, you heard those young people say they don't watch the local news, they don't really trust newspapers or TV anymore. How to change that?
Again, we have to change the way we do business. That's a crisis for the industry. It's a crisis for us to lose this generation of people who say that they are turning off and tuning out on news. That means they're not hearing a lot of vital information because they're so turned off by the depictions of themselves that they're seeing. We've got to do a better job. We've got, as Morgan said, change the narrative.
Derek Bellini, can local TV news cover crime in the context of trends? Like you said, okay, this was a particularly violent weekend, but let's put it in context of what was happening in the 90s or 2000s. Can news directors make the choice to cover it like that?
You can make the choice. It has to be an intentional choice with rules and guidelines and decisions that are made in that morning meeting, understanding that those decisions are going to have a longer effect. Some stations have made that commitment, but it is a tough choice because it means committing resources when you first decide to cover a crime.
Morgan, what about the impact of this kind of coverage on victims of crime in Chicago? How about that?
Well, let me tell you, when we first started the Tribe, we didn't have any resources, and we signed up for the alert system for missing persons, and it went off so frequently that we got overwhelmed, and I quickly knew that we didn't have the resources to cover it. I just want audiences to know that news directors make decisions. They're decisions based on resources, based on time, and based on your priorities. I'm not proud of that, but for the more well-resourced newsrooms, I think we need to say, why do you have the resources to cover every single shooting, but not every single missing person? You know, we can ask those things of the news.
And clearly, these things are very essential for viewers or for consumers of news. They want to know these things. Very important discussion. We're glad you're here to have it with us. Derek Blakely, Charles Whitaker, Morgan Elise Johnson. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And up next, the role social media plays in telling stories about violence and crime. So please stay with us. The relationship between social media and violence might not be as cut and dry as some make it seem. And here to talk about that aspect, the connection between social media and violence, we are joined by Lance Williams, right here in studio from Northeastern Illinois University, and Forrest Stewart, professor of sociology and director of the ethnography lab at Stanford University. Welcome both of you here to Chicago tonight. So Lance Williams, so you're over at NEIU, but one of the very interesting things you do, you're an expert witness in cases and speak to judges about what is or is not gang related on social media. So talk about what that entails.
Well, what it entails is that with the new formations of social media and pop culture, there is it's very difficult for those that are not immersed in the culture, particularly of youth pop culture, to differentiate between what are traditional elements of, let's say, gang activity and what we see in the music industry as it relates to pop culture and youth. So my job is to, in cases where things go left and crime and violence pops up, is to help the court differentiate between traditional gang activity and young people who are just involved in pop culture expression.
All right, so what's the difference between like a tweet or some social media post that is pop culture expression versus one that is an overt gang signal or something?
So in pop culture today among young people, it's very popular to identify with neighborhood affiliation that may have a particular name after an individual in the neighborhood who may have been killed, throwing up hand signs that are similar to what would be perceived as gang signs, different kind of language that's associated with gang banging. So you see that a lot among young people today in social media and pop culture as just a popular thing that young people do. However, some of those elements are found commonly in what we would call traditional gang activity, territory, neighborhood territory, gang symbols, fashion, dress, tattoos. All of these things now are kind of tied together. And so my job is to help tease them apart so that you could tell one from the other.
So it's important things for judges to know in these cases. Forrest Stewart, as part of your research, you spent about 3 years with a gang on the south side of Chicago. I'm sure you learned many, many things, but what did it teach you about the connection between social media and violent crime?
Absolutely, yes. Spending time with young people is, I think, invaluable for this conversation. I spent time with guys with this particular gang from the time they got up to the time they went to bed. And one of the things that I discovered, which kind of surprised me, was just how far of a gap there was between what we think social media is doing for violence in our neighborhoods and what it's actually doing. If we look at the statistics, actually in the exact time when social media was being taken up by gang-associated folks and young folks in violent neighborhoods. That's a time, as some of the folks earlier in the show pointed out, that's a time when Chicago is at some of its safest. And so already the statistics are leaning against this kind of conclusion that social media is driving violence. Well, one of the things that we see when we're actually with young people is just how much they're turning to social media and some of these exaggerated shows and performances of violence as a kind of performance to gain some street cred that doesn't actually spill out into the streets. So it's the same kind of exaggeration that all of us do on social media. As a professor, academics, we kind of boast and exaggerate about how smart we are, right? CEOs and entrepreneurs exaggerate about how rich they are. These are all of us trying to, right, get a like, get a click, show us that we're worthwhile, get us a little bit of love. Well, in violent neighborhoods, where one of the best commodities you can build for yourself, social statuses you can build for yourself is street cred, a reputation for toughness, of course this is going to come online. But I think what we often forget, and I think what's lost, particularly in media portrayals, is that the hundreds and thousands of seemingly overt violent posts, content, pictures that are being posted online every single day are not necessarily leading to violence.
And Lance Williams, we've heard from police officers that say, we're beefing up our social media monitoring for that reason, because sometimes violent crime starts with a post or with bragging. So is that what you've seen, that actually it's not really, there's not a really huge connection here?
Yeah, I don't think so. And I think what I'm seeing in the courts is I see prosecutions, I see investigations that are trumping up kind of charges around social media activity, where young people who may flirt with, street life, we call them, internet gangsters, so to speak, as we used to, talk about studio gangsters, that you're only tough and gang banging online, but in actuality, it's not playing that way out in the street. So what I'm seeing in the courts is just a heavy focus on these social media posts, connecting them to real life violent events or gang association, in ways that young people who are just flirting are getting caught up in a real way in the court system, and many of them are destroying opportunities that they have for the future, getting locked up and just having all kind of negative repercussions from just their social media activity.
Forrest, is that something that you saw where young people might have been engaging in some kind of activity on social media and it had been monitored and it was the basis for law enforcement, coming and taking some action?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the places where I've seen it the most are actually among, say, probation officers. Probation officers following young men's social media accounts. And instances that probation officers think indicate that they're engaged in violence. They're recommending to judges to violate these young folks, to send them back to jail or back to prison on account of what they've written on their social media accounts. I'm actually engaged in a national research project currently now alongside public defenders, where we're actually seeing people's sentences increased. We're seeing bail either denied or revoked. We're seeing all kinds of increased penalties based solely on the appearance of, say, a gun. We don't know whether it's fake or real, or the defendants showing up on social media, threats, gang signs being flashed out in front of, a park. These are all things that once they come into court, once they come into the criminal justice system, they're actually leading to longer sentences that, certainly I and other folks who study this issue think is a real kind of invisible form of injustice that a lot of us are only barely beginning to see.
Obviously, a lot of implications of that. So, Lance Williams, from what you've seen, is it worth the resources here for police officers to spend so much time monitoring social media, or is it better used elsewhere?
Oh, absolutely. I think resources need to be directed elsewhere. I think what we're seeing, particularly in law enforcement investigations, we're seeing investigations that are led by individuals who have no clue of how social media operates. They have no clue of the structure and function of the streets. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand the language. They're misinterpreting a lot of things that are being said, associating one incorrect thing with another incorrect thing, and then the implications for that, of course, are devastating for young people who may be involved peripherally to what's going on in a particular case.
All right, it's a very fascinating discussion. We have to leave it there. My thanks to Forrest Stewart and Lance Williams. Thank you so much for joining us. And that is our show for this Monday night. Join us again next Monday for the latest in our Safer City series, and be sure to follow our ongoing coverage online. Join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. The amount of money spent on Chicago police overtime is on track to break a record this year, a WTTW News exclusive. And talk about an early morning wake-up call. WTTW News investigates illegal trash pickups by multiple local waste haulers. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great evening.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a personal injury law firm pleased to give back to the community through numerous charitable initiatives.